Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Dis Afami History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past, what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present, and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you.
In today's episode, we welcome Jada Benn-Torres, a genetic anthropologist and associate professor at Vanderbilt University. Her research focuses on the Anglophone Caribbean, exploring the genetic ancestry and population history of African and Indigenous Caribbean. So, let's listen in.
Thank you so much, Jada Benn-Torres, for coming on to the podcast and to speak about your research, the genetic anthropology in the Caribbean, primarily. And I guess when we start, what would be, what drew you to research pre- and early contact histories, especially in Jamaica, through a genetic lens?
So, this is actually kind of a longer story, longer narrative, but my kind of arrival in anthropology and genetic anthropology was actually a series of happy accidents and happy mistakes. So initially when I went to school, I went to be a medical doctor. Mm. And then like many people, organic chemistry and biology at the same time was a lethal combination. So that wasn't going to happen. At the same time, while I was taking those courses, was an anthropology course on human osteology, so learning the kind of skeletal anatomy. And I actually really loved it. I would lose time in the lab just learning about the bones and learning how to read, how a person lived based on human remains. So I ended up going to graduate school to do forensic anthropology, and I did that for about a year, right? Maybe a semester and a half. So kind of that first year in graduate school. And it turns out I really like the lab work, but I don't like the actual reality of doing the work. In that line of work, you end up encountering people that have had very violent and untimely deaths. And it was changing the way I saw the world. So I had to figure something else out. Mm-hmm. Right. Well, I was sort of having this crisis. There was a lab that opened up next door to the the forensic osteology lab. And it was a genetic anthropology lab. And I actually had some experience working in labs, from doing summer science programs, et cetera. So I just asked to volunteer in there, and they're like, we could do a little more than volunteer. And from then it's just it took off. So this was the early 2000s. So this was the very beginnings of these direct to consumer companies sort of emerging. So a lot of that technology was still new at the time. And what I ended up doing for my dissertation was to use those sort of technologies of using DNA to look at ancestry and how, where people came from. And I applied it in the Caribbean. This sort of came about because my family, we are Trinidadian. And my father actually used to do a lot of our own genealogy. So he had these questions, and I thought it would be super interesting to be able to apply these technologies to answer those questions. So for my graduate work, I ended up traveling across the English-speaking islands, collecting DNA samples from people, and then using the DNA to get an idea of where in West Africa people would have come from. So in a few minutes, I can pull up a slide to kind of highlight some of that. So the work itself, and my interest in it comes from both the kind of professional academic aspect and then a very personal aspect. Now, my work in Jamaica specifically was something that I'd done was after I got my degree. Now, I guess it's about 10 years ago. But from doing the initial work across the Caribbean, I encountered a lot of folks who said they had indigenous ancestry. If you looked at them clearly, they're like, okay, yeah, I believe you. Yeah. And this was contrary to everything that I had ever learned about the Caribbean. I was told early on, the indigenous people wiped out, didn't exist. And yet, here I am at the time, it would have been like 2001, 2002. There's clearly an indigenous person right there. I'm just like, what's going on? So I got really interested in understanding more about that and like, why would I be taught this when clearly there are people here who, descend from the first peoples in the Caribbean. So in my reading, I came across the Maroons specifically in their own oral histories of having ancestry among, what the books say is like the Arawaks. So we don't necessarily use those terms anymore. Mm-hmm. But the point is that the the very first Maroons were actually indigenous people, and then later Africans came. And it made total sense to me that, okay, you're taking off to escape slavery. You're in completely new territory, new ecology. How are you going to figure out what's safe to eat? How do I make a life here? Well, the easiest thing is to go ask the folks that have figured out, because they've been here for 2,000 plus years. Mm-hmm. So, the oral histories made sense. So I thought it would be really cool to see if if I'd be able to detect indigenous ancestry in contemporary Maroons. So that kind of launched the project in Jamaica. So again, this was work that was done over 10 years ago. So folks still are, and rightfully so, a little apprehensive about giving their DNA to whoever. But luckily, I was able to gain the trust of 50 folks in a compound town, and they allowed me to sample their DNA, and I did detect indigenous ancestry. If I were to redo that study today, I would use a different series of markers. So the genetic markers I used, they're considered low resolution. So they'll give you a general idea about, continental ancestry. Yes, this is a genetic marker that is common in Africa. So if you see it if you see it in the Caribbean, you know that person has African ancestry in the case. But I was able to detect indigenous ancestry using those low resolution markers in a compound town. So as I mentioned, if I was doing this again today, I would use a different series of markers that are a little more high resolution. And I suspect, given what I found just using low resolution markers, as well as the oral history, people know their knowledge. They know where they come from. I suspect that I'd probably find increased amounts of indigenous ancestry among peoples who, have this history of it. Beyond Jamaica, I've also done work more recently in Puerto Rico. So Puerto Rico itself is just super interesting because there are high amounts of indigenous ancestry. We've known this since the early 2000s from a series of projects. What was kind of interesting, and based on some of my own work, I specifically work with people who identify as Afro-Puerto Rican. And, we don't necessarily have time to go into it, but the ways in which people self-identify in Puerto Rico, if they hyphenate, it's actually a very political statement. And I specifically want to work with people who are cognizant and very much in touch with their African ancestry, only because those histories have been purposefully obfuscated. We don't know about it because it was kind of the goals of colonialism, maintaining slavery, to ensure that these are people who don't have history. But we know we do. And genetics provides this tool to kind of look at things from a new perspective. So in doing that work in Puerto Rico, specifically with Afro-Puerto Ricans, I was able to detect indigenous ancestry along paternal lineages. And this is something that had never been seen. So those early studies in the early 2000s found indigenous ancestry along maternal lines. So we know that it was like indigenous women that were contributing their DNA. And again, makes sense in terms of the way that colonialism happened, where European males basically we just put it politely, contribute their genes to any community. Basically it was rape is what it was. Mm. But in those early studies, they didn't see any genetic signatures of indigenous men. And the common narrative was that the indigenous men had gone extinct. When I looked in Afro-Puerto Ricans, and it was a really small number of Afro-Puerto Ricans, it was actually like 30 of them, as opposed to some of the earlier studies had 400 plus people. When I looked in these 30 Afro-Puerto Ricans, I found indigenous ancestry on the paternal side, right? Mm-hmm. So this is telling us that indigenous males survived, and they were contributing genes to what we now understand as Afro-descendant communities. Mm-hmm. So there's some Afro-indigenous interactions that have happened. I know specifically in Puerto Rico, and there's a couple of other islands where Trinidad, and I've seen it in St. Vincent as well. So there's a whole history there that needs to be explored, and genetics provides this one way to do this. While genetics are really interesting, I try never to prioritize it above what people say, right? So these communities have oral histories, things that were passed down generation after generation. And I think those are just as valid to know and learn about the world as genetics is. Genetics is just one thing, and there's limits to what genetics can see. No, so it's really interesting to kind of bring it all together. Yeah, but Jamaica was kind of that first area where I was just like, oh, this is really cool. There's something to be learned here. Like African descendants and indigenous, folks were interacting. They really were.
No, absolutely. And as you said, it's just an enhancement to the oral stories that are there, and it's further confirming those oral stories. So it's not just a hearsay type of thing. So Before we go any further, could I have you just kind of define some of these terms that you may talk about, like ancient DNA or mitochondria, or of course Y chromosome and autosome and admixture?
Sure. So ancient DNA refers to the genetic material that we can study from human remains. So when people die, when they pass away, we can still detect their DNA. It's best preserved in like either long bones or in the teeth. So parts of the body that kind of take a longer time to degrade. When we study ancient DNA, DNA from past people, we have to have very specialized lab settings. And it's only because DNA that might come off of my body, like when I breathe, it'll be in like the cells that come out of my body or hair or skin cells. It's going to be in excellent shape because I'm alive. I've got all these repair mechanisms that are happening. And if it gets or mixes with ancient DNA, the DNA from the living person is going to replicate more. It's going to be a lot easier and it will swamp out the ancient DNA. So what we have to do is we have specialized labs where, you do everything possible to keep your DNA to yourself, clean the lab many, many, many times using both chemical washes and even UV light to be able to focus on the DNA from the human remains. This is actually a much larger topic. Right now, the field is really grappling with doing ethical research. There are people in my field and people of, particular mindsets that think that if a person is dead, then, it's free for all, that anybody can study it. But there are a lot of people who don't feel that way. They still feel very much connected to their ancestors, and they have very strong opinions about if it's going to be studied, and if it's going to be studied, how it's going to be studied, how it's going to be talked about. So the field is actually kind of grappling with what ethical research looks like. And of course, because there's such a spectrum of how people feel about their relationship to past peoples, there's no one size fits all. For some communities, it's perfectly fine. And for other communities, they don't want it to happen. And others, it can happen, but only under specific conditions and in communication with descendant communities. So there's kind of a influx right now. Yeah. So that's ancient DNA. Let's see, the next term, and I have too many windows open.
I think it was mitochondrial.
Mitochondrial. Okay. Yes. The mitochondrial DNA is DNA that is located within almost all of our cells. So typically in like biology class, you learned about, DNA is the blueprint of what makes us us. Most of our DNA is located in a portion of our cell called the nucleus. So if you think about an egg, it would be like the yolk. That would be where the nucleus is, where our DNA is. In our cells and cells of mammals, there are these little organelles that produce energy for the cell. And these are known as mitochondria. And mitochondria are really cool because they actually have their own set of DNA. Okay. So this is DNA, again, not located in the nucleus, but located in these little organelles called mitochondria. Mitochondrial DNA has a different inheritance pattern than the DNA located in your nucleus. Mm-hmm. The DNA in your nucleus comes from both of your parents. Half of it comes from your mom. The other half comes from your dad. Mitochondrial DNA is only inherited from your mother. Okay. Mm-hmm. And only females pass it to their offspring. So everybody has mitochondrial DNA. And if we were to sequence it, your mitochondrial DNA looks like your mother, and her mitochondrial DNA looks like her mother and her mother and her mother back in time. Okay. Another really cool and interesting thing about mitochondrial DNA is that there are specific portions of it that we can trace to different continents. Okay. Let's see, before I jump into this, let me show you this little schematic here. Mitochondrial DNA. Screen. Okay. So, over here. Try to blow this up. Maybe I could do that. Okay. All right. So you see mitochondrial DNA. In our pedigree here, this is our schematic to explain how things are inherited. So if we look at this bottom part, these little bars and circles, that represents our DNA. So this circular part, this represents mitochondrial DNA. So this is what I was talking about, nuclear DNA. So this is the DNA that comes from both of our parents, and then in the little organelles known as mitochondria, that has its own DNA, and this comes from the mother. So this DNA is represented by the circle. And you could see that this blue circle is the same blue circle that this person got from their mother, which they got from this grandmother, and back in time. Okay. So that's mitochondrial DNA. There's something similar, but for men. So again, everybody has mitochondrial DNA, both men and women, and it always looks like their mother, and only females pass it on, right? So if you are a woman and all you have are sons, that's the end of your mitochondrial line. It will not be represented in subsequent generations. You have to have a girl child who has a child, and that DNA line will continue. So for men, we have the Y chromosome. So that contains all the genetic material that makes men chromosomally male. And you inherit it from your father. So in this schematic, this is like this little red bar. You could see comes from the father. It is the same as the grandfather. So that's passed through time. So both in mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome DNA, there's little segments that we can sequence, and we know that they are common in some parts of the world and not as common in other parts of the world. So if we sequence that part, we could say, oh, you have this and it's super common in Africa, or it's super common in the Americas, or super common in Europe or Asia. We would say, in that case, because you match on that segment, you have ancestry from there. Okay. So that's mitochondrial DNA, and that's Y chromosome.
Okay.
DNA.
And then for autosome.
Okay. So autosomes, we'll go back to our image here. Autosomes are the DNA that you've whoa. I have to leave the meeting. Try to hit share. Goodness. Autosomes are the DNA that you've inherited from both parents. Okay. So it's represented here in these two kind of colored bars. And this is a very simplified example. But the way I want to walk you through this is that we're going to look at the grandparents' generation. And you could see that you've got these solid color bars. That's representing the DNA from this generation. And what happens is that in every generation, it will, through the process of meiosis, making your sex cells, you'll get a little bit of genetic shuffling. So what you're going to see here in this individual, that bits of DNA are going to be exchanged. Okay. And the son here has inherited DNA that has bits of DNA that has been shuffled in the mother. And it's the same thing as happening here. It's just because they're two versions of green, you can't really see. Look here, you can see that there's been shuffling. So every generation there's shuffling. And this explains why you look like your mother's side and you also kind of look like your father's side. It's because of genetic shuffling. So these are our autosomes. So again, we get half of our DNA from our mom and half from our dad. So when we look down here, we can see that this is just DNA that has been shuffled generation over generation from both sides of the family. And those are autosomes. So when we use autosomes in ancestry testing, it gives us a more general picture of a person's family history. If we use the lower resolution markers, so mitochondrial and Y chromosome, we only know about like one lineage, one part of the family. And that's kind of the benefit to using autosomal markers.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And then, of course, and how do you analyze and collect the genetic data for this type of historical research?
Okay, so it's actually a multi-step process. So even before I get to what I'm showing you on the screen, the initial work really just involves finding the community and speaking to people, finding out what they're interested in, seeing how that might align with your academic obligations. And then once you've kind of agreed on that, the process really involves getting ethical approval of your work. And this looks different depending on where you are. But just as a minimum, because I'm at an institution that receives federal funding, there are actual federal laws that have to be followed. And one of that is just getting ethical review through the Institutional Review Board. So the IRB. That involves really just filling out a lot of paperwork, explaining in detail exactly what you'll be studying, what you're going to be asking of people. And then you get a full review. A panel of them will review it, and they'll ask you usually to revise or to make any sorts of changes. And then you get approval. Depending on where I'm researching, I might also identify a community group or panel that can also provide an ethical review. That doesn't always exist, but the point is I do try and go to the community and make sure that it is okay for me to even be there to speak with people. once you kind of have your approvals in place, the community is down for you doing this work, then I will approach people. And again, this happens in different ways. It really just depends on where I'm at. But each individual then has to provide consent to be in the study. So providing consent means we'll go through a consent form. I'll tell them what the study's about, what's asked of them. They'll have an opportunity to ask questions and then make a decision as to whether or not they want to participate or not. In the past, I've done this by talking to like large classes of college students, recruiting there. Other times it's been really grassroots and I'm literally in someone's living room and just talking to them and seeing if they're interested in doing the study. But once all of that is completed, then I usually will collect a DNA sample from them. And this can happen in many forms. I'm a little partial to saliva collection. It's just a little easier to work with and you get high quality DNA. Sometimes in the past, I've used a buccal swab, which just looks like a big cotton swab that's rubbed on the inside of your mouth. Causes no pain, but basically what you're doing is picking up cheek cells. And then from those cells, you can get the DNA. So as I have here on my schematic, we'll get the saliva. We have specialized tubes that have a buffer in it that stabilizes the saliva, prevents growth of like different bacteria. And then I'll take it to my lab and then we do a series of chemical washes. Basically, that's the way we extract the DNA, just using different chemicals to essentially crack open the DNA and the nucleus and extract the genetic material. From there, if we're looking at autosomal ancestry, so that was that, I guess, third type of genetic marker we discussed. It tells you something about both sides of your family. There are different ways to do that. The way I've used is using these arrays, which are basically these little chips, microchips that have kind of different aspects of genetic data adhered to it, and then your DNA will adhere to it. And then through kind of just a complicated series of steps using a sequencing machine, we're able to discern the DNA sequence. Once we have that raw genetic data, then there's a series of analyses, statistical analyses that we do to look at ancestry, right? So we can, I think these arrays, they actually do have data from the mitochondrial, from the Y, and from the autosomes. So we can get all of it off of these sorts of arrays. And then we use, like I said, different statistical tests to estimate admixture, et cetera. So that's kind of the upshot of how we actually go from a person getting their permission, their saliva, their DNA, and then the actual analysis. There's a lot more to be said about the different analyses in terms of what makes it good, what makes it not as good, what are some of the complications. But that's just the general overview of how we estimate genetic ancestry.
No, thank you. That's a multi-step process. So good to know that it's not just you take the sample and that's it. There's many things or many factors that play into that as well. So what have you discovered about genetic makeup of Indigenous populations in the Caribbean before European contact?
Let's see. Sure I could find a schematic for that, but just kind of to give you the upshot of it is that what we see genetically actually aligns pretty well with what we see archaeologically, right? So the material culture that first peoples in the Caribbean left behind suggests an origin somewhere in the Orinoco River Valley. So kind of in South America, and then individual groups moved from the south to the north, basically island hopping. And that both the archaeology and the genetic data suggest that there were multiple waves in which people came. Some of the very earliest waves where people ended up kind of in the greater Antilles, when later populations came, for whatever reason, they didn't seem to really mix. And we don't really know why or what happened with that, but genetically, we don't see signatures of that. So it's kind of cool to see that the peopling of the Caribbean happened in waves, and people had the knowledge and the technology to island hop and to figure out how to get from place to place and take advantage of different resources so that they could thrive.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the main things we see.
Nice. Because and to further go on to that, you shared some, but is there any more to share in terms of the insights of their migration patterns of these pre-contact population?
I don't have specific routes. I just do know it was from the south, like Trinidad up the Eastern Antilles, the chain, and then into the Greater Antilles. We do know that there was a lot of movement back and forth once people were in the islands, but a specific route, no, I don't really have that. The upshot of all of this is really that more work needs to be done. identifying people that identify as indigenous. That's kind of complicated. There are some political issues in describing or defining yourself that way. In addition, when human remains are found in the Caribbean, because it's so warm, the preservation is not great. And then I shouldn't even say secondarily, but for me, a big issue and kind of the primary issue is the ethics of this. Just because we can, should we? And if we can, who speaks for the dead? Okay. It looks, again, very different depending on where you are and the history, the colonial history even of the islands in terms of how accessible human remains are to researchers. But for me, I'm of the mindset that this is still somebody's ancestor. A living person should speak for them. There should be a lot of care in terms of how these remains are handled, how they're studied, why they might be studied, et cetera, what sorts of questions you might be interested in learning about. And this is sort of an evolving area, at least from my perspective. It may look different, from the standpoint of a Caribbean institution or a European institution, but there needs to be a lot more discussion with descendant communities about how these remains are to be studied, how they're to be handled, how they're to be used. But that's kind of the upshot of what we know. Again, there's a lot more work that could be done. I'm hoping, eternal optimistic, that in the future, like representatives from the University of the West Indies, all of the campuses would become more interested in doing this work. It is expensive. Prices are coming down, but I think it can be done in ways that serve local communities and honor ancestors as well.
No, definitely. And I don't remember if we spoke about this, but was there any evidence found of interactions between the indigenous population and the European settlers?
I'm trying to think about the ancient DNA. There's not that many ancient DNA studies that have been done. I know archaeologically we do see, like, there'll be different sites where you'll see material culture from both indigenous people, maybe Africans and Europeans. This is kind of colonial times. So we know that there was some level of interaction. In terms of genetically, we have evidence of admixture in living people right now. So we know that people were definitely interacting in different ways.
Yeah, no, thank you. And what was determined from the African population of where they came from on the continent of Africa? Particularly from, I guess, Jamaican, what were their genetic markers to indicate that?
So this is kind of interesting because I've been all over the English-speaking islands and then recently doing some work in Puerto Rico. The African origins, to the extent that I can tell, actually looks a little bit different between those in the English-speaking islands and those in the Spanish-speaking islands. And it kind of makes sense given the ways in which slavers basically would procure enslaved peoples. They were coming from different parts of Africa, and we do see that reflected in living groups. I'll share with you a results slide from one study that I've recently done, and this was in collaboration with Dr. Maria Nieves Colon. She's a professor at University of Minnesota, and I had her help me analyze some data that I have from Afro-Puerto Ricans. Here we are. Okay. Some data that we have from Afro-Puerto Ricans. And in this, we were looking at ancestry specific. This is a PCA, principal components analysis. This is basically a data reductive technique that allows us to look at variation within a population and kind of see where they align most closely to different reference populations. Okay. So in this scatter plot that you see here, you kind of read it in the same way that you would read a map. So points that are near to each other, that means they're genetically close as well. Points that are further away, like a map, it means they're genetically, or, if it was a map, geographically, they would be more distant. Okay. So what we've done is that we've got two comparative populations. So we have our test population. So those are Afro-Puerto Ricans, and they are represented. They're represented here with the little triangles. We have a reference group of Puerto Ricans. So these are data from Puerto Ricans, and it's part of a publicly available database. It's the 1,000 Genomes Project. Another population in the 1,000 Genomes Project that is also used as reference data are from people in Barbados. Okay, so that's ACB ACB, represented here by the little circles. Okay. So in this plot, what we've done is we are looking specifically and only at the African ancestry. So everybody in this plot has a minimum amount of, I think it's at least 25% African ancestry. And then we have some reference populations also from publicly available data, but they're of African populations, and we've put them into these geographic categories, right? So green representing Senegambia, Upper Guinea, this orange, Lower Guinea, and Slave Coast, and you can see the rest. So the way you would read this is you would look at those reference populations and see where your Puerto Rican, Afro-Puerto Ricans, and Barbadian communities are kind of most aligned with. And that gives us some idea of shared ancestry. Okay. So in this case, what you can see is that the Afro-Puerto Ricans, so those are represented by triangles, they're kind of spread out throughout the whole plot. We see some folks up here in the green, a bunch kind of in the orange, a little bit in the purple, and then a little bit in the pink. So it's telling us that of the people that I sampled that identify as Afro-Puerto Rican, some of them have ancestry in Senegambia, Upper Guinea, Lower Guinea, Slave Coast, and to a lesser extent in Nigeria and West Central Africa. Okay. This looks a little bit different when we look at those from Barbados. Okay. So different colonial history. They were settled colonized very early by the British. And the way the British tended to colonize islands was to get there, either exterminate or remove the indigenous population and then bring in enslaved labor to work plantations. Okay. So what we see in Barbados, based on this plot, is you got, again, focusing on just the circles in this case, but you see a lot of their ancestry coming from Lower Guinea, in the Slave Coast, as well as to a lesser extent, Nigeria and the Bight of Biafra. Okay. So when you start to think about where did the English have their slave castles, it's kind of in that region of Western Africa. Okay. For the Puerto Ricans, again, you kind of see some overlay, but you also see regions that aren't really represented in or with African ancestry from people from Barbados, right? So you're seeing the Senegambia kind of area. And again, if you were to look in the archives, different history books, as well as records from like churches and things that actually recorded birthplaces and what people said where they were from, you'll see that Senegambia and as well as kind of the Upper and Lower Guinea played a larger role, like in Puerto Rico specifically. And we see that reflected in this plot as well. Again, in this case, we're looking at the triangles. Those are Afro-Puerto Ricans and the little plus signs. Okay. So you see that the African ancestry is kind of coming from different areas. Mm-hmm. Also looking to contemporary communities, you will see when you kind of take an in-depth look at some of the traditions, African traditions that I guess are persisted or have otherwise sort of evolved in African descendant communities, you'll see that they come from different parts of West Africa. And again, that's a testament to these different African origins. This can be done. I would love to see a project like this done on a larger scale that involved way more islands and then obviously a little more comprehensive across West Africa. It would be really interesting, for example, to see if we were to include African descendant peoples from Brazil. Because a large proportion also were taken from the kind of Angola area, and it would be really cool to see the extent to which their genes are reflecting that ancestry, and then how it's different from other African descended people in the Americas. I don't have anything like this specifically for Jamaica. These are all sort of open avenues for the next generation of researchers who are coming to kind of do this work. They would be really, really interesting to see and put it into conversation with kind of the living oral histories that people already have and know about their communities.
Yeah, this is just really fascinating work. And I guess going to that oral histories is like, how does, I guess, with the genetic findings or really connect with the historical records and the oral histories within the Caribbean?
Probably they match. Sometimes they match and sometimes they don't. And to me, it can be uncomfortable, but that's also where things kind of get really interesting. With African descended communities in particular, there's so much that wasn't written down because our ancestors were just not in a position to be able to write or record history in that way. And, you know, to me, that's the exciting thing of using genetics in this way, is that we can sort of answer questions that were unanswerable before. At the same time, sometimes using genetics will open or provide answers to questions that maybe we don't want to revisit, right? So sometimes you'll have instances of, so-and-so is not actually the biological parent of so-and-so, but it happened. It happened. So you do have to kind of be prepared for those sorts of answers as well.
Definitely. And what would you say are some of the challenges that you have faced in conducting some of this genetic research on historical populations?
Oh, some of the challenges. So I started doing this work in the early 2000s. So there's a lot more things that you can do with DNA now that you couldn't do in the past. People are also a little more knowledgeable, but also at the same time, a little more skeptical about just giving their DNA to whoever. So you need to make sure, or I've had to make sure, that I appropriately represent what I'm doing, who I am, to ensure that people trust me with their DNA. Gosh, what are other challenges? Ethically, and this is actually a good thing, ethically, there's a lot more hurdles that have to be addressed to do this research. Technologically, things are actually getting a little bit better. It's actually a little less expensive now to have DNA sequenced and to manipulate samples so that you can get high quality DNA. It's a little easier than it was in the past. I think another challenge that I face are really thinking about good ways to represent my findings to the community, ones that I've worked with, and sort of a broader community. Making sure that if I write an article, I try and make it open access, which I have to find money to do that. But to me, that's the right thing to do so that anyone, including people that participated, that they could read it without having to pay, the journal money for it. And those are kind of the main things that I think are some of the challenges. Some of them are the same over time, and really just explaining the science can be complicated, very necessary, but just explaining it can sometimes be complicated, but it's part of the job.
Yes, definitely part of the challenge. But again, what would you say you hope that your research will have on the impact that it will have on the perception of Caribbean heritage?
I think I would like people to really think about history as not being as static as it seems. We know what we're taught. We know what we've read, but it's always possible to go back and rewrite, reread, rethink about what has happened, present it in a different light, present it from a different perspective. And it's my hope that the kind of work that I do helps people to think about things in a new perspective. I once was working I think it was in St. Vincent, and one of the participants was kind of excited to see me asking these questions because they themselves were actually grappling with what it meant to be Indigenous. Historically, it had certain connotations, and it was ones that people don't necessarily feel great about. But thinking about, their history in this way and thinking about it as a legitimate thing to study, to learn more about, to use science in a way to address questions that have been left open or aspects of our own identities and communities that have been shoved aside. We're using our science in ways to think about that in new perspectives. I think that's great. And that's what I'm hoping to at least initiate and to start new conversations and new avenues for research, but ones that elevate and help us think about our past in a different way.
Definitely. As long as that conversation is always open, I think that's the main key. And are there any, educational programs or initiatives that you are involved with to promote this knowledge?
At the moment, aside from my own research, not right now, I have been involved in other initiatives that are, I guess they're just more broadly about genetics education or evolution education. I've been involved in some of those. When I go around to different universities or I'm invited to speak with community groups, I will talk about this, but I, always just generally encourage young people to take an interest in science. And, despite what you see or the people you see doing this research, keep in mind that this same research can be done in ways that serve you and your own community. I mean, it's hard to kind of get into it and find your way, but do keep in mind that just because, it's been done a particular way, it doesn't always have to be that way. And that this type of science, these types of questions that we ask, they can be done in service of our own communities.
Definitely. And you're definitely carving out a path for yourself. So that's, really great. And I know today we discussed a lot of different topics, but from your perspective, what would you like to leave the listeners with today in terms of with this subject?
Leave readers with, I'm sorry?
Leave the listeners with today.
I would be excited if people thought more about genetics and genealogy, and if it is something they want to do. I don't necessarily want to, force it down anyone's throat, but I think it's a kind of really cool technology. It has the potential to really change the ways in which people think about themselves and their communities. If this is something that, you might want to pursue, I would say go in with your eyes wide open, which means you've got to do some homework. Understand that if you're going to, sign up with one of these ancestry testing companies, understand what you are buying. It does mean you've got to take some time. And if you come from a tradition, a community where you want to consider the people around you, your family, you ought to. Keep in mind that when you send your DNA in, it's not just you, but to some extent, it's telling something about your mother, your father, your siblings, your cousins, your entire family. If collectively you all don't want that out there, then obviously don't participate in those sorts of things. If this is something though that you might be interested in, I'm all for getting involved in it. We know that for generations, families were broken apart, as part of, just being sold away to different parts of the Americas. Genetics actually provides a way for us to start making those wider community ties, putting them back in place. While we might not, specifically recognize so-and-so as a cousin, to know that you share DNA with XYZ and that you all shared a common ancestor who lived 200 years ago, 100 years ago. That's pretty powerful. It certainly goes beyond the trope of, oh, your people were enslaved. There's nothing else to say. There's a lot more to say. Genetics, again, is just one way to help get us there. So, my kind of parting thoughts on this would be, if you care to get involved, know what you're buying and then have fun with it. See what you can learn about, your family and sort of the more recent history of your community.
No, thank you so much for this talk, for the discussion, and sharing what you've uncovered and your research. So I do appreciate your time, Jada, and thank you so much.
No problem. My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Hoped you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcast. Thank you.